So the problem with the way that kingdoms function in this world is they all think that they are more clever, more cunning, more intelligent than the others. And even if they have good intentions, or what they think are good intentions, and they actually may be, to one degree or another, some mixture thereof of good and bad intentions, the reality of it is the complexities of the world, of geopolitical reality, of psychosocial dynamics, societal dynamics beyond it, are such that when you look at how things actually play out, when you look at how human nature is vulnerable to corruption, so it's corruptible, those that have a worldview that don't really believe as such play that out, and it becomes to be seen in the outcomes thereof as their worldviews are shown to be insufficient, their beliefs mixing with their ignorance, their arrogance, and their own corruptions thereof. And all of those things swirl around together to create the reality of what we would call global insanity. If you remove deterrence, it's a form of codependency. Codependency is a psychosocial, emotional, relational version of addiction. That's why it always comes bound up with addictions and those that are addicted.
Vehicle on shoulder ahead.
And so when you think of that from a point of view of what that means, in the bigger reality of human relations, geopolitical, geostrategic relations, what one finds is that the stupefaction of people increases in a exponential ratio to their fear, their confusion, their pride, and all the things that are derivative from it. And when that plays out at a nation state level, you have the kind of insane world that we have right now. Not only do you have people that are doing what's right in their own eyes, but you have nation states that are doing likewise. And so the resulting chaos brings about conditions that are destructive, to destroyer. And that's pretty much what we're living through right now. We're living through the idiocy of a world that is, for all practical purposes, self-destructing, because it is determined to do things according to their own wisdom and their own works of the flesh, apart from the Spirit of God, the light of the truth, and humility. And because of that, their minds are darkened, and as they grow darker and darker and darker, They grow in fear and more confusion, and ultimately all that results in delusion, and delusion leads them into their destruction. I have said this over and over and over in 1,000 different ways, but there's a reason why I am continuously coming back to this fact, because when you think about it, you think about where we're at, what's happened is that people are being turned over to their insanities. And there's no amount of rational discourse, facts, evidence, truths that will change the mind of a fool or persuade the lives of the arrogant and prideful to change their path past a certain point when it reaches a certain critical mass. And so they create the conditions that actually will shatter and crush them, or the weight thereof will break them to the point where it forces them into a place of humility where they're actually willing to let go. You see, the interplay between people and nations, as I've explained in innumerable ways, is real. That's why I can interchangeably use the terminology of psychology as a quite literal and metaphorical hybrid use of language to explain both at the same time. So let's go back to appeasement. When you appease your enemies, you're also gaining something from it. And that is, it allows you to play the victim. And as you're playing the victim, you self-justify victimizing others. It's a dysfunctional reality. It's a mutually parasitic relationship. And as that plays out at the nation-state levels and within nation-states themselves, you can see the malady thereof and the intensity of the vortexing effect and how it metastasizes and amplifies into a cognitive pathogenic spread that impacts all the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations. When you think about why it is I use the term Mystery Babylon, well, Mystery Babylon, and if you take the semiotic, the symbol, right, the descriptive metaphorical use of a woman riding a beast, a dragon, it's very interesting when you start unpacking that, because you think about language use, right? Think about somebody who's always trying to put you down, always going off on you, always accusing you, beating you down. What do you say? Right? Get off my back. Well, that person's riding my back all the time. Right? So there's that element of it. That's a great metaphorical use of language to explain this at macro levels and micro levels. And then it's also sexual. It actually has a sexual imagery to it, a debauchery to it, right? And then there's the other part that you become the beast you fear so that the beast won't eat you. At least that's what you think. But it's actually the trap, because eventually you run out of the ability to keep feeding the beast. The more you feed the beast, the more you become a beast, and the more you become the beast you feared, and then you devour one another. Both are destructive paradigms. Both are born out of addiction of a sort, right? Codependency of a sort. And it's born out of avarice and hubris, pride, fear, confusion, ignorance, arrogance, all the things that corrupt both human nature and nation states. And as those things amplify, the insanity of it grows in direct proportion to the level at which the delusion and darkness take root, to the point where eventually not only do you have massive conflict, but you also have massive destruction. Societies fracture, systems atrophy, and the resulting maelstrom in the chaos fuels more the fear, confusion, refusal to let go, and attempt to control. And all of those things impact everybody. There's a macro level meta effect, as well as a micro outplay or outflow or micro cascade effects. So the micros and the macros are unified in their actual desolations. It is the inverse, a photographic negative, if you will, of how things should be. So when you look around you and you see the inversion of things, you're actually observing the outward effects on the surface of a spiritual reality that's superimposed on the observable physical reality, right? That most people don't comprehend, they don't see, they cannot discern. So they're even more vulnerable to it and easily deceived by it. Now think about that. Think about why I bring that up and why that's a big deal. As you interact with people, as you interact with society, I mean, it has an impact on everybody. We're all dealing with it. So like in a biblical framework, particularly in a New Testament one, the way that that is spoken of is that your enemy is your own flesh, the world, or, the world being the things that are of the world, in the world, that are opposed to the kingdom of heaven, and the corruption that dwells both in the flesh and in the macros in the world, right, collectively. And the final of that dark triad is the conception or the idea or the actual aggregation of that being Satan, the adversary. So I bring that up for a very specific reason, because there you have what I call the outside and the impacts of the spiritual meta-reality of the corruptive forces rather, upon individuals, so peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations. So another symbiotic, or set, I would say it's, another version of the dark triad would be these three terms: the ancient serpent, the dragon, and the Satan, the adversary. Those are directly connected to something that's referred to in the book of Revelation, as well as it's metaphorical, or it's using figurative language in the book of Revelation, but in the Dead Sea Scrolls it uses another set of images, and that would be the three nets of Belial, or Belial. Belial being a Hebrew word that means worthless. And those three nets are pollution of the temple, meaning your physical body, your mind, right, your perceptions, and all the things connected to your flesh, right? And then also that of number two being stolen wealth, health, opportunity, relationships, you name it. Anything can be taken from you, your joy, all those things, right? And then here's the third net. The third net is sexual enslavement, idolatry, perversion, right? So all three of those in that dark triad are represented in the ancient serpent, the dragon, and the Satan. And when you consider what I'm telling you, and you consider that these triads, these dark triads, are spoken of in many ways, it is a corrupted and corruptive influence that has very real implications for how people view the world, view themselves, view one another, and also how that plays out from the micros to the macros. Now think about what I'm telling you and why I'm telling you this. Think about some of the ways and some of the things that have occurred in history, and think of it in terms of how it plays out in triads, in dark triads. Right? We talk about the Axis powers, right? I want you to think about why that plays out in those dark triads, at the macros and at the micros. And I want you to consider what the implications of that actually is, and why it's a big deal. Because there's not a single person here that's not being affected by it in the micros and the macros, from the micros and the macros. And I tell you this for good reason, because as these things play out, as these things occur in front of you in the observable, they're not happening in a vacuum. Everything in the heavens and on earth are exposing it. Everything's telling you a story. Everything is actually speaking to you and trying to point you in a direction to see what's happening and how it's affecting everything else. Now, what the hell does this have to do with appeasement, codependency, and addictions? Well, power is an addiction. Power is a great addiction. It may be the greatest addiction because what comes with power is all the other addictions. Wealth, so greed, lust, influence, vanity. All these things, all sins, what we would call sins, are in a sense geared towards enslaving appetitive desires and inverting appetitive desires along with perception, cognition, decision-making, and actual outworkings in actions and behaviors. So, appeasement, being a geostrategic, we're talking at a geostrategic level, a geostrategic form of codependency, what would that look like if you were to explain it from a micro level of a drug addict and their codependent significant other, or family members, or friends? What do codependents do? Codependents enable the addict to continue being an addict and continue on in their addictions. And why would they do that? They must be getting something from it. So what are they getting from it? Well, they're feeding on something, and what they're feeding on is it's fueling their own self-justification in a false victim narrative to justify their own debaucheries, their own corruptions. And in a sense, it is an emotive and cognitive addiction. It has its own psychological and physiological interplays that are corresponding to and bundled with the same kinds of things that go on within the physiological and psychological makeup of those that are actually physically addicted and psychologically addicted to substances. So greed, actually, the same areas of the brain that fire up in cocaine addictions and other substance addictions, right? It actually maps very closely. The greed maps very closely from a neuroscientific point of view in the brain. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the reality you live in and why the flesh is corrupted or corruptible, right, has direct ties to the vulnerabilities thereof and what works on it and how you think and the interplay at the micros with others and your physical environment and the broader reality of the world and all the things in it that are of it that are opposed to the kingdom of heaven. That being the truth, right? And of course we say the truth will set you free. Well, there's nothing more obvious than an addiction, because an addiction makes you a slave to something that's destroying you. And that's why the temptation of the things that are addictive are so strong. It lures you in order to make a slave out of you to feed on you. And there's a very real spiritual reality attached to that. It's parasitic. It's subtle. It's in the meta-reality, meaning beyond the perceivable, although you see the effects of it in the perceivable. So when we talk about spiritual reality and talk about the impacts and effects of it, we're very serious. When we say things like, nothing good dwells in the flesh, that presupposes something can actually dwell in your mortal coils, in your flesh, in your thinking, and affect you, influence you. In a sense, you could call it spiritual influence operations. And they're hostile. It's malign influence. It's meant to harm you, to deceive you, to lure you into traps, to enslave, and then use you as a proxy to do its bidding, and ultimately use you to destroy others and yourself. So what would that look like if we take that same kind of perspective and play that out between nation states? What does that look like? Well, it looks like geopolitics. It looks like wars. It looks like nations trying to poison and influence others in a hostile way to be able to control them, to plunder them, to destroy them and kill them. Does it not? If you apply what I'm telling you from the micros and how individuals that are caught in addictions and the codependency of those that enable it, how that plays out, right, between people. Think about that between nations. And then you start to see why I talk about the things I do and why I talk about them the way I do. And if you're willing to actually take the time to think about it and hear me out, what I'm doing is I'm pulling a veil off the world and showing you what really is, what you actually really live in, and why things really are the way they are. And you should ask yourself why it is that, if that's really the case, why is it so many people actually don't care to listen to something like this, or actually have a conversation about this, or even have an interest in this? Why would that be? Well, it's because they have essentially bought in to the ways of the world, and they're captured by it. It's reality capture. Right? They're blinded by the world. They're blinded by this, as we would say, the spirit of the age, or the zeitgeist. They're enamored by everything that actually is destructive, whether they realize it or not. They care more for the things in the temporal than they do about the things in the temporal that might destroy them, even as it's destroying them, than they do the truth and the reality of what they actually live in. Now, one could say that that's actually characteristic of addictions and codependency. Now couldn't you? So all of those things happen at the micros and the macros. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. So when you're looking at things in your own life, in your own family, in your own neighborhoods, your towns and cities, your counties, states, the nation or nations, and the interplay, right? There's a reason why we call it relationships. Okay? We have relationships with others. We talk about different types of relationships, transactional relationships, right? Selfish or destructive relationships, unhealthy relationships. Well, the same thing plays out with nation states. You see, it's a scalable, uniform model from the micros to the macros and the macros to the micros. All of it is showing you something and peeling back the layers of reality and showing you how things really are in this world at this time and even in your own life, and how you deal with one another and how nation states deal with one another. And you wonder why it is that the world is filled with fear, confusion, chaos, conflict, suffering, destruction, all manner of avarice and hubris. Well, after listening to this talk, you should know why. Because I'm revealing these things, I'm showing you these things, and this is what you live in. This is why things are as they are. So when Christians talk about things like, be in the world but not of the world, what does it mean to be in the world and not of the world? Well, the cares of this world are deceptive. They're also fleeting. So too are the lusts of the eyes and the flesh itself. I mean, think about how your markets work. You think your economic system would work very long if people were actually content? Why do you think it is you have to actually advertise things? You have to actually constantly fuel and inflame the desire for more stuff, more things, more people, places, and things. The entire global economic system is built upon not contentment, but wanting more that doesn't ever bring contentment. You see, there's not enough temporal people, places, and things to fill an infinite hole that only God's Spirit can fill. You see, even all these things are still pointed to something greater than all these things. That's why we say things like, what does it profit a man or a woman, for that matter, to gain the entire world and lose their own souls? Because all the things in the world are not enough to fuel an infinite appetite. That infinite appetite of the flesh, even though it is anathema or opposed to the kingdom of heaven, actually still points to the very thing it's opposed to. There's an irony for you. And what is an addiction? An addiction, you never get enough. You always have to keep feeding the beast, right? We even call addictions oftentimes by that kind of language set. An addiction promises something it can never give while taking everything away that you have. Another way of putting that is it's an absolute and total lie. It's a deceiver, and it comes to kill, steal, and destroy. Which is why we say that Satan, your adversary, comes to kill, steal, and destroy. Are you tracking with me? Do you understand what I mean? Everything here, regardless of what it tells you, can't actually be for you what only God can be for you. And so if you're replacing God with something that can't be, but yet promises happiness, satiation, if you just get that next thing, you'll be happy, right? Get more money, more power, more wealth, more, then you'll be satisfied, then you'll be happy, right? But there's not enough more to actually do that in the entire universe. That's because what you're trying to feel in the flesh is something that can only be given in the spirit within you and satisfy you from the inside out. That's why I'm always talking about the inside out versus the outside in. So, if God is the only thing that can fill that hole, and you've got an entire world, an entire system that's built on telling you and sustaining itself in something that cannot, well, you need to ask yourself, what is that world trying to do and trying to be that it can't be? It's trying to replace or take the place of the Spirit of God. Meaning that it is playing God, and it makes you bow before it as if it was God, when it is not God. It is a deception. It is a lie. It is a destroyer.